A story of betrayal.
He had the trust of my family.
A one-on-one conversation with the man who says Archbishop Theodore McCarrick abused him for almost 2 decades. Results are in. Nearly 2 weeks after the midterm elections, winners are declared in hotly contested races in Florida and Georgia. We'll tell you if any of the victors are pro-life. The poor in spirit. Pope Francis delivers a message to Christians on caring for the needy, including the unborn and migrants. And love for the little flower. A report from EWTN Nordic on how Sweden is honoring the relics of 3 French saints. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, November 19, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsbee, in for Lauren Ashburn. We must forgive the bishops. It's probably the last thing you would expect to hear from a victim of clergy sex abuse. But that's exactly what the man who claims Archbishop Theodore McCarrick abused him for nearly 2 decades tells me. I spoke one-on-one with James Grein in his first interview since revealing his identity to the public. He says the disgraced archbishop shattered his trust, but he also says it didn't destroy his faith.
I didn't see him every day, but every day I saw him, he abused me.
60-year-old James Grein says it's difficult to relive the painful memories of abuse. After decades of silence, he's opening up about Theodore McCarrick, the former Archbishop of Washington, who he says molested him for 18 years.
He's a sad, weak man who has lost his faith in Jesus Christ.
James was born in New Jersey to a big Catholic family. He tells me McCarrick was a longtime family friend, a man he called his Uncle Teddy.
He was part of the very fabric of my family. And so when he came to visit us, whether it was in New Jersey or in California, it was important that he was there because the priest is here. The holy man is here, and we all have awe towards him.
James says his father told him to do whatever Uncle Teddy said, that he could trust then Father McCarrick. And so, James says, as a child, he opened himself up completely.
I was able to sit across from him and talk to him and show him my body language and really get to the depth of what was going on because I trusted him more than I've ever trusted anybody.
That trust was shattered in 1969 when he was 11 years old. That's when James says the abuse started. It happened at his family home in New Jersey when the two were alone. He was afraid to tell anyone, even his own brothers and sisters.
What did you say to yourself in those times when you were alone?
That I must hide what is happening to me. I cannot tell anybody, and I have to protect myself from anybody else, because if this man's doing it to me, how many others are going to do this to me if I open my mouth? And I cut myself off from God, from other human beings, and got lost.
James stopped going to church as a teen and began drinking and eventually using drugs. For the next 2 decades, it got worse. When he was 33 years old, he tried to commit suicide by overdosing on gin and prescription painkillers.
I went to an emergency room. They said to me that they had somebody for me to talk to. I was afraid, but I did. The person on the other end of the phone said, 10 years ago, I did the exact same thing you did tonight. And today, I live happy, joyous, and free. That was God. Been a lot of God moments.
It was then, in 1991, that James stopped drinking and doing drugs and started praying again. He stopped speaking to McCarrick and began a path to recovery. James hopes to lend his voice to other victims of abuse and addiction and let them know they're not alone. As for the now disgraced Archbishop,
I pray for him every day so that he may feel the need to repent, to just tell the truth.
James tells me he's disappointed the U.S. bishops won't be taking any action on clergy sex abuse for the moment. He says the bishops are not being held accountable. If you're the victim of clergy sex abuse, contact the National Abuse Hotline. It's 800-656-HOPE. It's run by an organization called Grein. A devastating wildfire in California has already killed at least 77 people, and crews are searching for more human remains. The fire has also destroyed more than 10,000 homes. This weekend, President Trump visited the disaster zone. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. We have an emotional, faith-filled testimony tonight from a man who lived in Paradise, the California town mostly burned to the ground. It's one of the places President Trump visited over the weekend, and today I asked the top White House official what needs to change to avoid this type of tragedy.
We obviously need to figure out a better way to help prevent this type of devastation in the future. I think everybody shares that goal, regardless of their party affiliation.
Over the weekend, President Trump visited a town called Paradise, now in ashes. And there's a long list, about 1,000 names of people unaccounted for in Northern California.
We're looking for hundreds of people right now. There are literally hundreds that they're looking for.
No deaths have been reported among the St. Thomas More community in Paradise, but the parish hall and rectory are destroyed. Greg Kidder is the church operations manager.
I've been holding back all this emotion.
He's been busy making sure 800 registered parish families are accounted for, a project he believes God has given him.
You're not thinking about what you've lost. You're merely thinking of how you can hold together with each other, with God's grace.
Days after Greg and his wife Yvonne helped school kids and parishioners evacuate the church grounds, they got word their home had burned down. Still, their hope remains intact.
What am I going to do tomorrow? I don't know. God will provide. God will put something in front of me that I'll have to make a decision about.
And seeing so many people help one another gives Greg more proof of the Catholic faith he confesses.
The very things that we believe in are true, are real.
Pope Francis offers his prayers to the wildfire victims. The Holy Father asked the Lord to give peace to the victims, comfort family members, and sustain all those involved in rescue efforts. Wyatt.
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. Pro-life Republicans win in the battleground state of Florida. The state finally wraps up Senate and governor race recounts. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reports nearly 2 weeks after the election. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. These Florida races were so close, they were legally required to recount their 8 million votes. Now 2 Florida Right to Life endorsed candidates can claim victory. Republican Catholic Ron DeSantis wins the governor's race, while current Republican Governor Rick Scott is the state's next senator. He unseats a veteran Democrat.
Republican Rick Scott beats 3-term Democratic Senator Bill Nelson. But Nelson says he won't stop fighting for what he calls human rights.
Civil rights, women's rights, LGBT rights, and the sacred right to vote. We must end all forms of voter suppression.
Dr. Grazie Christie of Florida points to the importance of judicial nominations.
It was very important to a lot of people that I know, and a lot of people across the country, to elect Republican senators that would support pro-life judges, and especially judges that hew to the Constitution.
With Scott's win, Republicans add to their Senate majority, a majority that can confirm more of President Trump's judges. In the race to be Florida's governor, conservative Congressman Ron DeSantis beats liberal Democrat Andrew Gillum.
More than 4 million of you decided that you wanted a different direction for the state of Florida.
Florida Congressman-elect Michael Waltz says Floridians are sticking with the GOP, in part because of the booming economy.
We've seen Republicans win, and I think that's a reflection of our emphasis on individual liberty, individual responsibility, kind of the sky's the limit, small government, deregulation, pro-growth, kind of pro-economic agenda.
In Florida, a state with nearly 2 million Catholics and a large percentage of Hispanics.
We want what everybody wants, a good job so we can raise good families.
In Georgia, Democrat Stacey Abrams came in 60,000 votes short of a win. She's refused to officially use the word concede to the winner, Republican Governor-elect Brian Kemp. Now, Abram vows to sue in federal court for a reform of the electoral system. She blames Kemp for what she's calling voter suppression. Wyatt?
Jason, what can you tell us about the results coming out today in Texas?
Republican Will Hurd squeaked by his Democratic challenger for the win. Hurd is one of a few GOP Trump critics in the House. His district stretches from San Antonio all the way to El Paso.
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. The U.S. closes off one of its busiest border crossings with Mexico today in a move aimed at preventing a mass rush of migrants across the border. Tensions escalated yesterday as locals in Tijuana protested the arrival of a caravan, chanting, "Hondurans, get out, we do not want you," prompting the U.S. to close a pedestrian walkway for several hours. Tijuana residents accuse migrants of being messy, ungrateful, and a danger. They also call the caravan an invasion. The King of Saudi Arabia makes no mention of murdered journalist Jamal Khashoggi in a major speech today. King Salman also expressed support for his son, despite allegations the Crown Prince ordered the killing. President Trump says he is expecting a full report on the case this week. At least 42 people are confirmed dead from an attack late last week on a Catholic cathedral in the Central African Republic. One priest is among the dead. The group Aid to the Church in Need says the strike was in retaliation for a Muslim who was killed the day before. Sectarian violence continues to be a problem in the country. A Jesuit priest has been killed in South Sudan. Father Victor Luke Odiambo was murdered by unknown gunmen who stormed the order's residence. The Kenya native had worked in war-torn South Sudan for 10 years as a teacher. Catholics in the Dominican Republic hold their 7th annual ProLife March. Abortion currently is illegal in the country, which is 95% Catholic, but lawmakers are debating whether to make exceptions, especially in the case of rape or if the mother's life is in danger. Pope Francis says Christians cannot remain indifferent to the growing cries of the poor.
Il grido dei poveri diventa ogni giorno più forte.
The Holy Father invited 6,000 poor people to St. Peter's Basilica yesterday, where he celebrated Mass on a day the Catholic Church dedicates to the needy. Francis also drew attention to the plight of abandoned elderly people, the lonely, and migrants. Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley joins us from Rome. Juliet, Pope Francis created the World Day of the Poor in 2017. What was his message this year?
Well, this year, Francis defended the poor, saying the wealthy few enjoy what belongs to all. He cited the cry of the unborn, of starving children, children living in war zones, and the Holy Father also spoke of migrants and refugees and entire peoples deprived of their natural resources that should be at their disposal. Now, in his homily, Wyatt, Francis was very direct. He said Christians can't stand with their arms folded, they must act.
How did the Holy Father spend the World Day of the Poor?
He first said Mass in St. Peter's Basilica yesterday morning, and after Mass, the Holy Father sat down for lunch with 1,500 needy people. Now, if you're interested, they ate lasagna, chicken, mashed potatoes, and tiramisu for dessert, Wyatt. And Pope Francis thanked the volunteers who prepared the lunch. A band from the Shrine of Our Lady of Pompeii provided music and entertainment. And at the end of the lunch, each guest got to take home a gift of 1 kilo of pasta.
Pretty cool. Well, Juliet, what advice does the Pope have for the faithful to keep the poor in mind?
The Holy Father is saying that it's important for all of us to live our faith in contact with those in need. He made reference to Jesus reaching out his hand to save Peter, and Francis says Christians need to stretch out our hands as Jesus does and listen to the cry of the poor. He also says we need to give freely and not give simply out of duty, and we must remember to give to those that will never be able to pay us back. Pope Francis has made the poor a priority of his pontificate, as we know, and just last week he set up a temporary free health clinic for the needy in St. Peter's Square. In remarks to pilgrims and tourists in the square on an impromptu visit last Friday, he said it's futile to make riches our goal.
Such an important message as we look ahead to Thanksgiving, Advent, and Christmas. Juliet Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Coming up, Msgr Charles Pope on why he disagrees with the Vatican's request the U.S. bishops not vote on measures to combat clergy abuse. And it's a few days before Thanksgiving, why the White House is already thinking about Christmas. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsbee, in for Lauren Ashburn. A prominent Catholic voice says the bishops' annual meeting, which took place in Baltimore last week, was a disappointment. That's because the Vatican asked the bishops to delay concrete action on the abuse crisis. Msgr Charles Pope says in the National Catholic Register, quote, "To most Catholics, the Pope's actions and seeming resistance place the ownership of the scandal squarely in his court. He has increasingly become the face of the scandal." Joining me now is Msgr Pope of the Archdiocese of Washington. Msgr, welcome. You say the Pope owns this. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think by his own words and his own requests, he basically said, I don't want the American bishops to act on this alone. I want this to be taken care of here in Rome and when I bring other bishops from around the world in February. So I mean it respectfully. I think it's a disappointment, though, because it was such 11th hour. But in saying that he owns it, it's really his own preference to say, I want you to let me handle this with bishops from all over the world.
Many Catholics are frustrated as what they see as sort of inaction by the Vatican. You call it tone deafness. What do you mean by that, and what do you want the Vatican to do?
Well, I'm concerned, and as I say, I'm concerned. I think I'm also speaking for a lot of Catholics who are very concerned that this doesn't seem to be something urgent to either the Holy Father or generally the Holy Roman See. You know, there seems to be a well, we'll get to this. There are some people, even at the bishops' conference, who sort of said this is just a tempest in a teapot generated by right-wing bloggers and so on. And I just hope, and I'm urging our Holy Father and everyone in Rome to hear that this is very good Catholics from way across the spectrum are very deeply concerned and deeply hurt by a lot of this, and that we're going to have to, I think, help them to hear that. So now that this has shifted to Rome, we're going to have to be very clear to say, we need you to hear us now. And I'm encouraging Catholics to speak to their bishops and also to the papal nuncio here.
I'm hoping you can give a little bit more feedback there to what you're hearing from your flock. I mean, how have they been responding to the inability to take action? What have they been telling you directly?
Well, again, yes, across the board. The real issue, I think, is credibility. You know, that we don't seem to be able to handle this as a church. We get bogged down in all the debates, and then, the Holy Father's interjection, canceled even what votes looked like they were going to take place. And so this creates frustration, and even if there are legitimate concerns that Rome brings to this, I think that people are frustrated because it doesn't seem to be any way to restore credibility right now in the church.
Several U.S. bishops have also voiced their frustration as well. How do you think the bishops here in the United States can restore their credibility?
Well, I think, first of all, working in their individual dioceses. And I have to say that the Bishops' Conference, there were many beautiful things that were said there, and bishops who show they get it. They've heard God's people, and they're very concerned. And I'm just hoping now that they can continue to work with Rome and with the Holy Father to come out with a good outcome. And it's ultimately going to go to Rome, and I think that these bishops can make a big difference by working in their diocese and also speaking frankly and forthrightly to people in Rome.
We're only days away from the start of Advent. What's your recommendations to Catholics who are trying to set aside all the fear and anger and focus on upcoming Advent Christmas?
Well, even as we light candles in the Advent wreath often, because as it gets darker, we light more candles. And that's a spiritual concept as well. Maybe think about Advent this year. Maybe think about abstaining or fasting like we do during Lent. Certainly multiplying your prayers and lift up the Holy Father and lift him up before God and say, help him to come up with a good, strong solution for the church.
Call to the Holy Spirit's always a good thing. Msgr Charles Pope of the Archdiocese of Washington, thanks so much.
Thank you.
The President and First Lady received the official White House Christmas tree. The nearly 20-foot-high Fraser fir was grown in a farm in North Carolina. It is headed for the Blue Room, where it will become the centerpiece of the Christmas decorations at the White House. Volunteers will finish decorating the mansion later this month. Up next, Pope Francis makes peace the focus of his prayer intention for November. And the relics of 3 beloved saints are touring Sweden. We have a report from the Scandinavian country.
Tu corazón no hay paz, no la habrá en el mundo.
Pope Francis says peace comes through actions and not words. In his prayer intentions for November, the Holy Father encourages the faithful to practice peace in small things. He says if there is no peace in our heart, there will be no peace in the world. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsbee, in for Lauren Ashburn. A new book is helping converts and lifelong Catholics better understand the Church and its traditions. Catholic Traditions and Treasures, an illustrated encyclopedia, takes a look at the wide range of subjects from church leadership to the origins of many Catholic devotions. Joining me now is the author, Dr. Helen Hoffner. Dr. Hoffner is a professor at the School of Education at Holy Family University in Philadelphia. So Helen, this is your 6th book published. Your last book was on the Rosary. Tell us, what was the inspiration for this book in particular? What do you hope people will take away?
Well, my mother and I wrote the Rosary book. It was called The Rosary Collector's Guide. We exhibited our rosaries at churches and schools and colleges, and people come up showing us their religious articles and telling us stories about their practices. So really this book grew out of everything that people were telling me at the Rosary exhibits. What I would like people to get from it is that our Catholic traditions are not superstitions. People make jokes about burying a statue of St. Joseph and things like that. I'd like people to see the real historical background to them and not see them as superstitions, but see them as a link to the past.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that because in the dedication to your book, you spotlight the unknown artists and craftsmen of the Church's history. So what role do you think art plays in church tradition, and how do you think, I guess that sort of connects to why you added illustrations to this book?
Oh, tremendous link. You know, in the early days of the Church, not everyone was able to read. So many people learned their religion by looking at the stained glass images, and before that, holy cards, and it was really pictures that brought religion to most people. And I think it was the artists and craftsmen who did that for us.
It's so fascinating. You know, your book explains the origins of certain Catholic customs. Let's talk about one of them. Asking St. Anthony to find lost items. This is a common prayer by Catholics. Where did that come from?
And it was St. Anthony himself who did it first. St. Anthony was the head of a monastery. He had a very cherished book of Psalms, his Psalter, that he kept all his teaching notes and such in it. And when he lost it, he prayed to God to help him find it. And then all of a sudden, a novice there had been planning to steal the book. He decided to return it. So St. Anthony started it, and we're following his practice.
Very cool. In your research for the book, was there anything that surprised you?
I think what was interesting and surprising was the various Catholic customs by different groups. There are some that are, my family is an Irish Catholic background, and we have our traditions, maybe think about Our Lady of Knock and so forth. There are things like chalking the door on the Epiphany. That's very widely known among the Polish community, where maybe Catholics of other cultures don't know that one.
It's so interesting to hear about how diverse Catholicism is in that sense. How do you think we as Catholics can use books like yours that obviously highlight history so much, but how can you think we can deepen our own spiritual lives?
I think it gives us a link. And right now, when so many Catholics are questioning their faith, it's showing you that this is a real link to your past, either practices to the saints, and it helps us deepen our lives thinking about, in times of trouble, that we can rely on things like the Rosary. We can rely on the images that St. Joseph, St. Anthony gave us, and kind of know that our ancestors got us through these difficult times, and we'll get through them also.
Well, I find this to be fascinating, church history as well as all the traditions and where they come from. Dr. Helen Hoffner, author of Catholic Traditions and Treasures, an illustrated encyclopedia. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Finally tonight, the relics of St. Therese of Lisieux and her parents are on tour in Scandinavia. Our colleagues at EWTN Nordic take us there. It's a 9-week pilgrimage that began in late September in Stockholm, Sweden. On tour, the relics of St. Therese of the Little Flower and her parents, Zélie and Louis Martin, who were made saints in 2015.
To have her here, it was a reminder for the youth that we can be saints.
Stops include Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland. The goal? To bring the example of holiness of this famous Catholic French family to millions. It's a part of the world where many do not know the Catholic faith. Anders says it's a great experience for his parish, St. Lars in Uppsala, a city near Stockholm. He says the visit means a lot for all Christians, not just Catholics. Another parishioner, Vera, says she is overjoyed. And her husband says it's a memory he will carry with him for the rest of his life. Many Catholics consider the Tour of the Saints a historic moment for Scandinavia. The region became Lutheran in the 16th century and is now one of the most secular parts of the world. Most Catholics, who are a tiny minority in the Nordic countries, are immigrants. The tour of the saints' relics ends on November 29th in Iceland and the Faroe Islands. Our thanks again to our colleagues at EWTN Nordic who filed the story. And that wraps up our newscast for tonight. I'm Wyatt Goolsbee, and for all of us at EWTN News Nightly, thank you for watching. Be sure to join us tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.